Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Biloxi, Mississippi. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing which places and what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. On the night of December 23rd, 1836, the skies above Biloxi, Mississippi, turned an unnatural shade of orange. The Harland estate, once the crown jewel of the Mississippi coast, had been consumed by flames so intense that witnesses claimed they could feel the heat from nearly a mile away. In the aftermath, as the embers cooled and the smoke cleared, 7 bodies were recovered from the ruins. But it was the absence of one body in particular that would haunt the county for generations to come. The official report, filed by Sheriff William Mackey of Harrison County, stated that Jonathan Harland, the estate's master, had perished alongside his household in a tragic accident. A grievous error in judgment, they said, involving lanterns left unattended during Yuletide preparations. The case was considered closed before the new year. But there was something about the arrangement of the bodies, the timing of the blaze, and the peculiar behavior of Master Harland in the weeks prior that didn't quite fit the narrative of a simple accident. For nearly 130 years, the truth remained buried beneath the charred remnants of what locals came to call Harland's pyre. Until, that is, the spring of 1967, when a graduate student from Tulane University stumbled upon a collection of letters that would unravel a web of deception so intricate it would call into question everything the good people of Biloxi thought they knew about the respected Harland family. This is not a ghost story. What happened at the Harland estate was born not of the supernatural, but of something far more terrifying. The depths of human depravity hidden behind a veneer of southern gentility and wealth. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. In the winter of 1836, a fire started, but the real horror had begun long before the first flame ever sparked. The air in Biloxi that December was unusually cold. The kind of cold that settles into your bones and makes even the most stalwart souls huddle closer to their hearths. For weeks, a persistent fog had rolled in from the Gulf each evening, shrouding the coastline in a grey veil that muffled sounds and obscured the boundaries between water and land, between right and wrong. The Harland estate sat on a bluff overlooking the Mississippi Sound, a sprawling mansion of 22 rooms surrounded by 300 acres of prime coastal land. Live oaks draped in Spanish moss lined the half-mile drive from the county road to the main house, creating a natural cathedral that inspired both awe and unease in those who traveled it. The property had been in the Harland family for 2 generations, ever since Jonathan's father, Elijah Harland, had acquired it through what the older residents of Biloxi would only describe as questionable circumstances. Jonathan Harland had assumed control of the estate in 1829, following his father's sudden death. A man of 40 years, unmarried and educated at Harvard, Jonathan quickly established himself as a man of contradictions. He was known for his philanthropy, having donated generously to the construction of Biloxi's first proper schoolhouse and hospital. Yet there was a coldness to him that people found difficult to articulate. His smile never quite reached his eyes, which were described by many as being like chips of winter ice. He was respected, certainly, but never truly liked. The household itself consisted of Jonathan, his spinster sister Margaret, the estate manager, a Boston-born man named Frederick Winters, the cook, Sarah Turner, 3 house servants whose names were not recorded in any document that survived, and a groundskeeper known only as Old Tom. It was, by all accounts, a well-run household, efficient, quiet, perhaps too quiet. Visitors to the estate were rare. When they did come, they were invariably wealthy businessmen from New Orleans or Mobile, staying only a night or two before departing with haste. The locals noticed that these guests often arrived looking confident and left appearing troubled, though none would ever speak of what transpired during their stay. Jonathan himself travelled frequently, sometimes disappearing for weeks at a time with no explanation, leaving his sister and Winters to manage the estate. In the town of Biloxi, some 13 miles from the estate, rumours occasionally surfaced about strange sounds heard by fishermen passing near the Harland property at night. Wailing, some said. Others described it as the sound of desperate prayer. But such rumours were quickly silenced. The Harlands were powerful, and in the antebellum South, power was not to be questioned lightly. Margaret Harland was rarely seen in town. When she did appear, it was always in the company of her brother, and she spoke only when addressed directly. Those who encountered her described a woman who seemed perpetually on the verge of saying something important, only to retreat into silence at the last moment. Her eyes, unlike her brother's, were said to be expressive, windows to a soul in torment. By 1836, at the age of 38, she had developed a slight tremor in her right hand and had taken to wearing high-necked dresses regardless of the season. Frederick Winters had arrived at the estate in 1831, a thin man with a precise manner of speaking and meticulous attention to detail. He kept the ledgers, managed the staff, and acted as Jonathan's right hand in all business matters. The relationship between the two men was the subject of much speculation. They were often observed in intense conversation that would abruptly cease when others approached. Winters lived in a separate cottage on the property, a structure that, curiously, was positioned in direct line of sight with Jonathan's study window. Sarah Turner, the cook, was a widow who had come to work for the Harlands after her husband was lost at sea in 1827. She was known for her excellent cooking, but also for her discretion. Unlike many household servants of the era, she did not gossip at the market or share stories of her employers with friends after Sunday service. This silence earned her both respect and suspicion from the community. Some wondered what she might be hiding. Others assumed she was simply grateful for her position in a prestigious household. Old Tom, the groundskeeper, was an enigma. No one knew his surname or his precise age, though his weathered face and stooped posture suggested a man well into his 70s. He rarely spoke, communicating mostly through nods and gestures. His domain was the extensive gardens and grounds, which he maintained with religious devotion. He was known to work from dawn until well after dusk, tending to the maze of hedges that Jonathan had commissioned shortly after taking ownership of the estate. A labyrinth so complex that even frequent visitors required a guide to navigate it. The 3 house servants, whose names were lost to history, were described in sheriff's reports only as young women of good character. They slept in a dormitory-style room in the east wing of the mansion, the wing that would later be identified as the origin point of the fire. In the autumn of 1836, something changed at the Harland estate. The already infrequent visits from Jonathan to town ceased entirely. Supplies were ordered in greater quantities than usual, delivered by merchants who were met at the gate rather than being allowed to approach the main house as had been the custom. Windows that had previously stood open to catch the sea breeze were shuttered, despite the lingering heat of the season. Margaret was not seen at all during this period, not even at church, where she had previously been a regular, if silent, attendee. When the pastor called at the estate to inquire after her health, he was met by Winters, who assured him that Miss Harland was merely suffering from a womanly complaint and would return to services when she had recovered. The pastor later confided to his wife that he had heard what sounded like weeping from somewhere deep within the house during his brief conversation with Winters on the porch. In late November, Jonathan placed an unusually large order with the town's lumber merchant, enough wood to construct a substantial outbuilding, along with an excessive quantity of nails and other hardware. When asked about the project, he mentioned plans for a new stable, though locals noted that the existing stable was in excellent repair and more than adequate for the half-dozen horses the estate maintained. The lumber was delivered On December 1st, 1836, the merchant's son, who helped with the delivery, reported that Jonathan inspected each board personally, rejecting any with the slightest imperfection. The rejected pieces were immediately burned in a bonfire that seemed, to the young man, unnecessarily large for the task. He also noted that Jonathan's hands were bandaged, as if recently injured, though the master of the house offered no explanation for his wounds. In the weeks that followed, the sound of hammering could be heard from dawn until dusk, echoing across the water. Yet no new structure seemed to emerge on the property. Fishermen reported seeing lantern light moving among the trees on the estate's periphery at odd hours, sometimes as late as 3 or 4 in the morning. One claimed to have seen Jonathan himself carrying what appeared to be a shovel, walking purposefully toward the eastern boundary of the property where the Harland land met an expanse of swampland that was impassable for most of the year. On December 15th, Frederick Winters made an unexpected appearance at the office of Biloxi's only lawyer, a man named Thaddeus Cooper. According to Cooper's journal, which was discovered in 1939 during a renovation of the courthouse where it had been concealed behind a loose brick, Winters appeared agitated and requested information about the legal ramifications of breaking a confidentiality agreement. Cooper advised that such agreements were generally binding but might be voided if they concerned illegal activities. Winters thanked him, paid his fee, and left without specifying the nature of his inquiry. It would be the last time anyone in town saw him alive. On December 20th, 3 days before the fire, Sarah Turner visited her sister in town, ostensibly to deliver some baked goods as an early Christmas gift. The sister, Abigail Porter, would later tell investigators that Sarah seemed distressed. She kept glancing over her shoulder as if expecting to find someone watching her. Before leaving, Sarah pressed a small parcel wrapped in oilcloth into her sister's hands, with the instruction not to open it unless Sarah failed to return for their planned Christmas dinner. The sister, respecting Sarah's wishes, placed the package in a trunk in her attic where it would remain undisturbed for over a century. The events of December 23rd, the night of the fire, were pieced together from various accounts collected by Sheriff Mackey in the immediate aftermath. Around 7 in the evening, a stable boy from a neighboring property, cutting across Harland land on his way home from visiting a friend, reported seeing multiple lanterns moving about the grounds of the estate in what he described as a frantic manner. He thought little of it at the time, assuming the household was engaged in last-minute preparations for the Christmas festivities. At approximately 9:30 that evening, a fishing boat returning late to harbour noted an unusual amount of smoke rising from the direction of the estate, though at that distance and in the darkness, they could not determine its source. By 10:15, the night sky had taken on the eerie orange glow that would be reported by dozens of witnesses across the county. The fire was first reported to authorities by a rider who arrived in town shortly before 11, pounding on the door of the sheriff's office. The man, a traveler who had been passing near the estate, described flames reaching higher than the tallest trees on the property. Sheriff Mackey immediately assembled a group of volunteers and departed for the Harland estate. But by the time they arrived, the main house had already been reduced to a smouldering shell. The heat was so intense that they could not approach closer than 50 yards until well after midnight. As dawn broke on December 24th, the full extent of the devastation became clear. The mansion was completely destroyed, along with several outbuildings. Curiously, the hedge maze had also burned, though it was separated from the main house by a considerable expanse of lawn that showed no signs of fire damage. This suggested to some that there might have been multiple points of origin for the blaze, though this theory was not pursued in the official investigation. The recovery of bodies began later that morning. They were found in various locations throughout the ruins, some in positions suggesting they had been attempting to flee, others in postures that indicated they might have been asleep or otherwise incapacitated when overtaken by the smoke and flames. Due to the extensive damage, identification was difficult, but based on location and what remained of clothing and personal effects, investigators determined that the dead included Margaret Harland, Frederick Winters, Sarah Turner, the 3 unnamed house servants, and Old Tom. Conspicuously absent from the count was Jonathan Harland himself. Sheriff Mackey's initial report, dated December 28, 1836, concluded that Master Harland had likely been consumed completely by the intense heat of the fire, perhaps while attempting to rescue others from the blaze. This explanation was accepted without question by the town authorities, many of whom had business connections with the Harland estate and were eager to put the tragic incident behind them. The property, having no clear heir, was eventually acquired by the county and left largely untouched out of respect for the deceased. Over time, nature reclaimed the land. The foundations of the house and the charred remnants of the hedge maze became overgrown with vines and underbrush, transforming the once grand estate into a tangled wilderness that locals tended to avoid. Stories began to circulate about the land being cursed or haunted, though these tales were dismissed as superstition by more educated members of the community. And there the matter might have rested, consigned to the footnotes of local history, had it not been for the curiosity of a 23-year-old graduate student named Elizabeth Chambers. In the spring of 1967, Chambers was researching her doctoral thesis on economic changes in coastal Mississippi following the Civil War. During her investigation of property records in the Harrison County Courthouse, she noticed discrepancies in the documentation relating to the Harland estate. Specifically, she found evidence of substantial cash withdrawals from the Harland accounts in the weeks preceding the fire, amounts far exceeding what would have been needed for normal household expenses or even the lumber purchase that had been recorded. Her interest piqued, Chambers began to dig deeper. She tracked down descendants of Abigail Porter, Sarah Turner's sister, and learned of the package that had been passed down through generations, its contents never examined, out of respect for Sarah's wishes. The current owner, a great-great-granddaughter named Mary Porter Holloway, agreed to open the package in Chambers' presence. Inside the oilcloth wrapping was a small leather-bound journal. The first entry was dated June 3, 1831, shortly after Sarah Turner had begun working at the Harland estate. The final entry was dated December 20, 1836, the day Sarah had visited her sister for the last time. Between these dates lay a meticulous record of life at the estate and a catalogue of horrors that would challenge the very foundation of Biloxi's historical understanding. According to Sarah's journal, the Harland estate was not merely a home, but a facade for something much darker. Jonathan Harland, she wrote, was engaged in activities that she dared not name explicitly, but described as an abomination in the eyes of God and man. She documented strange deliveries that arrived under cover of darkness, always received personally by Jonathan and Winters. She noted the muffled sounds that sometimes emanated from the cellar, sounds that Jonathan explained away as settling foundations, but which Sarah described as the lamentations of souls in torment. Most disturbing were her observations regarding Margaret Harland. Far from being a willing participant in her brother's household, Margaret appeared to Sarah to be a prisoner. She was rarely permitted to leave her rooms without Jonathan's escort, and Sarah had once observed bruises on Margaret's wrists consistent with restraints. In one particularly troubling entry, dated March 17, 1835, Sarah wrote that she had heard Margaret screaming in the night, "Not again, Jonathan! I beg you, not again." The journal also contained references to guests who arrived at the estate in good health, but departed in states of apparent distress or confusion. Sarah noted that after such visits, she was often instructed to burn certain linens and clothing, regardless of their condition. On several occasions, she mentioned that Jonathan had required her to prepare unusual quantities of a medicinal tea made from herbs that she did not recognize. Herbs that Jonathan provided from a locked cabinet in his study. Frederick Winters, featured prominently in the journal as well, portrayed as a man increasingly troubled by his complicity in whatever transpired at the estate. Sarah described witnessing heated arguments between Winters and Jonathan in the autumn of 1836, though she could never hear the specific content of their disagreements. She noted that after one such confrontation in early December, Winters had approached her in the kitchen appearing greatly distressed and had asked her a peculiar question. "Mrs. Turner, do you believe that a man can be forgiven for evil done in service to another if he eventually finds the courage to resist?" The final entry in the journal, written in a hand that trembled noticeably compared to earlier pages, contained Sarah's suspicion that Jonathan was planning something terrible. She wrote of overhearing a conversation between Jonathan and Winters in which Jonathan had said, "It has gone too far to stop now. The only path forward is to erase everything." Sarah expressed her fear that Jonathan intended harm to everyone in the household and stated her intention to send the journal to her sister as insurance. She concluded with a chilling statement. "Should misfortune befall me, let this record stand as testimony. Jonathan Harland is not the man the world believes him to be. Whatever fate awaits us, know that he has orchestrated it. May God have mercy on his soul, for I cannot." Elizabeth Chambers, recognizing the historical significance of her discovery, brought the journal to the attention of county authorities. A limited investigation was launched, focusing primarily on the site of the former estate. What they found there lent credence to Sarah Turner's dark insinuations. Excavation of the area where old Tom had been seen heading with a shovel revealed a series of unmarked graves containing the remains of at least 12 individuals. Forensic examination, limited by the technology of the 1960s, could determine little beyond the fact that the deceased had been adults of various ages and that some of the remains showed evidence of restraints having been applied before death. The graves appeared to have been dug over a period of several years, based on the varying states of decomposition. Further investigation uncovered the foundations of a structure that did not appear on any known plans of the estate. A small building approximately 30 yards from the main house, with unusual features including what appeared to be iron rings embedded in the stone floor. This structure, concealed by the hedge maze in Jonathan's time, matched the dimensions of the lumber order placed shortly before the fire. Most significant of all was the discovery of a hidden chamber beneath what had once been Jonathan's study. This space, accessed via a trapdoor disguised as part of the flooring, contained the charred remains of what investigators identified as medical or surgical implements, along with glass containers that might once have held chemicals or medicines. The walls of the chamber were lined with lead, which had partially melted in the intense heat of the fire, but had preserved enough of the room's contents to make its purpose clear. It had been some sort of laboratory or operating room. What exactly Jonathan Harland had been doing in that underground chamber remains a matter of speculation. The prevailing theory among historians who have studied the case is that he was engaged in unauthorized medical experimentation, possibly related to the treatment of mental illness, an area that, in the 1830s, was still deeply misunderstood and subject to barbaric cures. This would explain Margaret's apparent confinement and distress, as well as the condition of the guests who departed the estate in states of confusion. Others have suggested darker possibilities, that Jonathan was involved in some form of cult activity, or that he was conducting experiments related to the extension of human life at the expense of unwilling subjects. The limited forensic evidence and the deliberate destruction caused by the fire make it impossible to know with certainty. What did become clear from Chambers' research, however, was that Jonathan Harland had not perished in the fire as originally believed. Records discovered in a bank in New Orleans revealed that a man matching Jonathan's description, using the name James Hartford, had opened an account there on January 2nd, 1837, just 10 days after the fire. The initial deposit was a sum almost identical to the amount withdrawn from the Harland accounts in Biloxi before the tragedy. Further investigation traced James Hartford to Charleston, South Carolina, where he established himself as a successful importer of exotic goods. He lived there until 1851, when he apparently died of natural causes at the age of 55. He never married and left no known descendants. His substantial estate was bequeathed to a medical research society that has no records of its activities prior to receiving Hartford's patronage. The fire at the Harland estate was no accident. Based on all available evidence, it appears to have been a calculated act of destruction, designed to eliminate both witnesses and evidence of whatever transpired there. The 7 people who died in that blaze were not victims of misfortune, but of deliberate murder, orchestrated by a man who valued his reputation and freedom above human life. Jonathan Harland, or James Hartford as he later called himself, escaped justice in his lifetime. His crimes, whatever their full extent may have been, were buried with his victims and nearly lost to history. Yet through the courage of Sarah Turner, who risked and ultimately lost her life to preserve the truth, and the persistence of Elizabeth Chambers, who refused to accept the convenient narrative of the past, a measure of recognition has finally been granted to those who suffered at his hands. The land where the estate once stood remains undeveloped to this day. In 1971, it was designated a memorial site, though few visitors make the journey to the overgrown clearing where the mansion's foundations can still be discerned beneath the encroaching vegetation. A simple stone marker, erected by the Harrison County Historical Society, bears the names of the 7 known victims of the fire. Below these names is a quotation from Sarah Turner's journal: "May truth, though delayed, eventually find its voice." For the residents of modern Biloxi, the story of Jonathan Harland and his burning estate exists primarily as a local legend, a tale told to tourists seeking the darker side of Southern history. Few connect the elegant, progressive Harvard graduate described in early accounts with the monster revealed by later investigation. It is easier, perhaps, to imagine such evil as an aberration, a singular darkness in an otherwise ordinary history. Yet the most terrifying aspect of Jonathan Harland's story may be its very plausibility. Behind the veneer of wealth and respectability, shielded by power and position, the worst of human nature can sometimes flourish undetected. The true horror lies not in ghostly manifestations or supernatural vengeance, but in the knowledge that monsters walk among us wearing human faces, and that the most dangerous predators are often those we least suspect. In 1968, Elizabeth Chambers completed her doctoral thesis, though its focus had shifted from economic history to an examination of how communities construct and maintain historical narratives that protect their self-image, even at the expense of truth. She would go on to become a respected historian, specializing in what she termed hidden histories, the stories that societies choose to forget or rewrite. As for the Harland estate itself, local officials have repeatedly denied requests for further excavation of the grounds, citing respect for the deceased. Some suspect this reluctance stems from a desire to avoid uncovering additional evidence that might cast the town's historical figures in an even more troubling light. Whatever secrets remain buried on that bluff overlooking the Mississippi Sound may never be brought to light. On particularly cold December nights, when fog rolls in from the Gulf and shrouds the coastline in grey, some say they can still hear the sound of hammering coming from the direction of the old estate grounds. Others claim to have seen the glow of lanterns moving among the trees, though no one has lived on that property for nearly 2 centuries. These are just stories, of course, the product of imagination and the human tendency to embellish tragedy with supernatural elements. The real horror of the Harland estate requires no ghostly embellishment. It lies in the documented facts. 7 lives cut short by one man's determination to protect his secrets, and a community that chose comfortable ignorance over uncomfortable truth. As you drive along the coastal road today, you might catch a glimpse of the overgrown path that once served as the estate's entrance. The live oaks still stand, their branches heavy with Spanish moss, creating that natural cathedral that inspired both awe and unease in visitors of a bygone era. Beyond them, hidden from casual view, lie the foundations of what was once called the crown jewel of the Mississippi coast, and the graves of those who paid the ultimate price for Jonathan Harland's secrets. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. But perhaps in remembering the victims of that distant December night, we keep another door open, the door to truth, however delayed, however painful. In the silent aftermath of atrocity, remembrance may be the only justice left to offer. In the spring of 1969, nearly 2 years after Elizabeth Chambers' initial discovery, a construction crew breaking ground for a highway expansion near Charleston uncovered a sealed metal box beneath the former residence of James Hartford. Inside was a leather-bound journal, its pages filled with the precise handwriting of a well-educated man. The first entry was dated January 3rd, 1837, just 1 day after Hartford had opened his account at the New Orleans Bank. The journal, now preserved in the Special Collections Archive at Tulane University, provides the only known record of Jonathan Harland's thoughts in his own words. While he never explicitly confesses to setting the fire or murdering the household, the implications are unmistakable. In one particularly chilling entry from March 1837, he writes, "The necessity of my actions at Biloxi weighs less heavily on me with each passing day. What was sacrificed was regrettable, but essential for the continuation of the work. I dream sometimes of Margaret's face as she realized what was happening, but such dreams grow less frequent. The pursuit of knowledge demands casualties. History will vindicate me." The nature of the work that Jonathan referenced repeatedly throughout the journal remains subject to interpretation. He wrote in a deliberately obscure manner, using private codes and references that historians have only partially deciphered. What is clear is that he believed himself to be engaged in research of profound importance, something that would fundamentally transform humanity's understanding of the mind and its limitations. Several entries suggest that Margaret was not merely a victim of her brother's cruelty, but an unwilling subject in his experiments. In July 1837 he wrote, "Margaret's condition was unique. Her dual nature made her the ideal vessel. Had she only understood the significance of what we were achieving, perhaps she might have embraced her role. Instead, her resistance necessitated measures I would have preferred to avoid." The new subject in Charleston shows more promise, though lacks the familial connection that made M so valuable. This reference to a new subject in Charleston raises disturbing questions about whether Jonathan continued his experiments after establishing his new identity. Local records from the period show no reported disappearances that could be directly linked to Hartford, but a physician's journal from 1840 mentions treating a woman who lived in Hartford's household, described only as his ward, for nervous exhaustion and selective mutism following experimental treatments. Frederick Winter's role in the events at the Harland estate becomes clearer through Jonathan's journal as well. Far from being a willing accomplice throughout, Winters appears to have grown increasingly troubled by whatever he witnessed. Jonathan wrote in February 1837, "F's betrayal still rankles. After all we accomplished together, his sudden attack of conscience threatened everything. The fire became necessary the moment he visited Cooper's office. I had anticipated needing more time, but his weakness forced my hand." This confirms what many had suspected. The fire was planned specifically to silence Winters before he could expose whatever secrets he had become privy to at the estate. The other deaths were, in Jonathan's cold calculation, simply collateral damage necessary to cover his escape and establish his new identity. Perhaps most disturbing are Jonathan's references to benefactors in New Orleans and farther north, who provided funding for his research in exchange for practical applications. These unnamed individuals, apparently men of wealth and influence, seem to have continued their association with him after he re-established himself in Charleston. One entry from 1842 mentions a visitor from Boston who expressed satisfaction with the results and authorized expansion of the program. This suggests that Jonathan was not acting entirely alone, but rather as part of some network of like-minded individuals pursuing questionable research beyond the boundaries of conventional medicine or science. The full extent of this network, and whether it survived Jonathan's death in 1851, remains unknown. The Medical Research Society that received Hartford's estate upon his death operated for less than a decade before dissolving, its papers and findings allegedly lost in a warehouse fire in 1859. This convenient destruction of records, following the pattern established at the Biloxi estate, has led some historians to speculate that the society may have been little more than a front for distributing Hartford's assets to his research associates, who then continued their work elsewhere under different auspices. In 1873, a physician in Philadelphia published a controversial paper on cerebral modification techniques that bore striking similarities to fragmentary descriptions found in Jonathan's journal. The physician claimed to have developed these techniques independently, but correspondence discovered after his death revealed connections to individuals who had served on the board of the Medical Research Society that received Hartford's bequest. This suggests the possibility that whatever work Jonathan Harland had been engaged in may have continued long after his death, its origins obscured but its influence persisting in certain branches of early psychiatric medicine. The full implications of this connection are difficult to assess, given the limited documentation that has survived and the deliberate efforts to erase certain aspects of this history. The human cost of Jonathan's research extended far beyond the 7 lives lost in the fire. Sarah Turner's journal makes reference to individuals brought to the estate who were never seen leaving, people whose disappearances might have gone unremarked in an era when record-keeping was sparse and travel hazardous. The unmarked graves discovered on the property in 1967 likely represent only a portion of those who fell victim to Jonathan's pursuits. Margaret Harland's fate is particularly poignant. Correspondence between Jonathan and his father, discovered in a collection of family papers held by a distant relative in Virginia, suggests that Margaret had displayed unusual sensitivities from a young age. In one letter dated 1823, Elijah Harland wrote to his son, "Your sister's condition continues to concern me. The episodes have increased in frequency, though she remains unaware of what transpires during them. Perhaps your studies at Harvard will lead you to insights beyond those available to country practitioners." This indicates that Margaret may have suffered from some form of seizure disorder or similar neurological condition that made her vulnerable to her brother's later research. Jonathan, rather than protecting his sister, appears to have viewed her condition as an opportunity for experimentation, a perspective that crystallized during his time at Harvard, where he studied both medicine and philosophy. I have consulted Dr. Hammond in strictest confidence, but he offers little hope of cure through conventional means. A former classmate of Jonathan's, in a memoir published in 1860, recalled that Harland had been obsessively interested in the relationship between the physical brain and the human soul, and had once been reprimanded for unauthorized dissections performed in his quarters. The classmate described Jonathan as brilliant but disturbing, a man who spoke of the human mind as if it were merely a mechanism to be disassembled and improved upon. This mechanistic view of humanity seems to have informed Jonathan's subsequent actions. In his journal, he repeatedly refers to his subjects, including his own sister, as vessels or specimens, rather than as people. This dehumanization allowed him to proceed with experiments that, based on the fragmentary evidence available, likely included crude surgical interventions, administration of unidentified compounds, and psychological manipulations designed to induce specific mental states. The full extent of what transpired in that lid-lined chamber beneath Jonathan's study will never be known with certainty. The physical evidence was largely destroyed in the fire, and Jonathan's journal, while revealing his mindset, is deliberately vague about specific procedures. This vagueness may have been a security measure, but it also suggests a man aware that his actions would be condemned if fully exposed to public scrutiny. In October 1969, during a particularly dry spell, a section of the old Harland property that had previously been swampland dried out sufficiently to reveal additional structural remains. Archaeological investigation determined these to be the foundations of a small outbuilding that predated the fire, possibly constructed during the first years of Jonathan's management of the estate. Among the items recovered from this site was a collection of glass bottles bearing labels from a pharmaceutical supplier in Boston, along with several handwritten journals that had been protected from the elements by the waterlogged soil that had covered them for over a century. These journals, in various hands, appear to be records kept by Jonathan of his observations of subjects identified only by initials. The entries detail behavioral changes following unspecified treatments, with clinical detachment that makes the implied suffering all the more disturbing. One entry, dated June 1834, reads, "Subject R.M. continues to exhibit profound disorientation following the third procedure. Speech is disordered but occasionally coherent. When asked to identify family members from photographs, subject now consistently identifies his wife as his mother and becomes agitated when the error is pointed out. Memory formation appears to be severely impaired, though certain childhood recollections remain intact and can be recalled with unusual vividness when the appropriate stimulus is applied." This and similar entries suggest that Jonathan was specifically targeting memory and identity in his work, attempting to alter or control these fundamental aspects of human consciousness. The purpose of such experimentation remains unclear. Was it purely academic curiosity? Or did Jonathan envision practical applications for techniques that could modify or erase memory? His references to benefactors interested in practical applications hint at more utilitarian motives. In the context of the antebellum South, the ability to manipulate memory and identity would have had disturbing implications for control of the populace, particularly those in servitude. While no direct evidence links Jonathan's work to such applications, the interest shown by wealthy and powerful men in his research raises troubling questions about their intentions. The discovery of these additional journals prompted a more thorough examination of the swamp area adjacent to the Harland property. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted in 1970 revealed anomalies consistent with additional burial sites, though environmental regulations and practical difficulties prevented excavation. The full count of Jonathan's victims may be higher than initially estimated, possibly numbering in the dozens rather than merely the 12 confirmed by the 1967 investigation. One of the most puzzling aspects of the case is the relative ease with which Jonathan established his new identity after the fire. His transformation from Jonathan Harland to James Hartford was accomplished with minimal difficulty, suggesting either careful planning or assistance from individuals with influence. Bank records show that the account opened in New Orleans was vouched for by a prominent businessman with connections to both the financial and political establishments of the city. This same individual later facilitated Hartford's introduction to Charleston society. The implications of such high-level assistance are disturbing. It suggests that Jonathan's work may have had supporters willing to assist him in evading justice, individuals who valued his research enough to overlook the murder of 7 people and potentially many more. The network of influence that protected Jonathan may have been more extensive than initially suspected, raising questions about how many others might have been complicit in his activities. In 1846, 5 years before his death, Hartford published a monograph titled Observations on Memory and Its Malleability under a pseudonym. The work, which attracted little attention at the time, contains veiled references to experiments that align with those described in his private journals. He wrote of the possibility of rewriting the book of human experience and liberating the mind from the tyranny of its past. These phrases, seemingly philosophical in nature, take on a more sinister aspect when viewed in the context of his actual research. The monograph came to light during Elizabeth Chambers' investigation and was identified as Hartford's work based on handwritten annotations in a copy found among his personal effects in Charleston. Analysis of the text by modern psychiatrists reveals concepts that were decades ahead of contemporary understanding, particularly regarding the plasticity of memory and the potential for external manipulation of identity. Some of the techniques obliquely described in the work bear disturbing similarities to methods later employed in discredited psychic driving experiments of the mid-20th century. This suggests that Jonathan's work, while morally reprehensible and conducted without ethical constraints, may have yielded insights that influenced later developments in psychiatry and psychology, albeit through channels that obscured their origins. The full extent of this influence is difficult to trace due to the deliberate obfuscation of sources and the destruction of records, but fragments remain that hint at a darker lineage for certain approaches to the human mind than is generally acknowledged. The final chapter of Jonathan Harland's story closed on May 15, 1972, when Elizabeth Chambers published her comprehensive account of the case under the title The Burning and What Came Before, Jonathan Harland and the Biloxi Estate. The book, which synthesized all available evidence and placed the events in their historical context, brought the full horror of Jonathan's activities to public attention for the first time. The publication was not without controversy. Descendants of prominent Biloxi families mentioned in the book attempted to block its release, arguing that it unfairly tarnished the reputations of their ancestors. A legal battle ensued, culminating in a court decision that allowed publication with minor redactions. The judge, in his ruling, wrote that historical truth, however uncomfortable, serves the public interest more than comfortable fictions that shield the powerful from scrutiny. Chambers' book prompted renewed interest in the case and led to additional investigations of related historical incidents. Researchers identified several cases from the same period involving individuals who displayed sudden and inexplicable changes in personality or memory following brief disappearances or illnesses. While no direct connection to Jonathan could be established, the patterns were consistent enough to raise questions about whether his techniques might have been employed more widely than previously suspected. In 1975, the Harrison County Historical Society established a small museum dedicated to preserving the record of the Harland case and honoring the known victims. The museum, housed in a modest building in downtown Biloxi, contains copies of Sarah Turner's and Jonathan's journals, archaeological artifacts recovered from the estate, and biographical information about those who died in the fire. A section is also dedicated to Elizabeth Chambers' research and the process by which the truth was finally uncovered after more than a century. The museum serves as a reminder of how easily history can be distorted when those with power control the narrative, and how essential it is to question accepted accounts that seem too neat or that serve the interests of the influential. It also stands as a memorial to those whose lives were sacrificed in the name of Jonathan's twisted pursuit of knowledge. individuals who might otherwise have been forgotten, their suffering unacknowledged, and their deaths unexplained. For modern visitors to Biloxi, the story of the Harland estate fire is a footnote in a rich and complex local history. Few make the journey to the overgrown site where the mansion once stood, and fewer still recognize the significance of what transpired there. The horror has faded with time, transformed into a story told to tourists seeking a thrill rather than a sobering reminder of human capacity for evil. Yet the case remains relevant, not merely as a historical curiosity, but as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power and ambition divorced from moral constraint. Jonathan Harland, educated and respected, used his position to conduct experiments that violated every ethical principle, secure in the knowledge that his status protected him from scrutiny. When discovery threatened, he did not hesitate to sacrifice innocent lives to preserve his freedom and continue his work. The parallels to more recent abuses in the name of science or progress are difficult to ignore. Throughout history, vulnerable populations have been subjected to experimentation without consent, their suffering justified by appeals to a greater good defined by those who would never themselves be subjects. The Harland case, while extreme, is part of a pattern that has repeated itself in different contexts across time. Perhaps the most important legacy of Elizabeth Chambers' work is not the specific details of Jonathan's crimes, but the methodology she employed to uncover them. By questioning official narratives, seeking out marginalized voices, and examining evidence that others had overlooked or dismissed, she demonstrated the value of historical revision, not as an academic exercise, but as a means of achieving a measure of justice for those who had been silenced. In her final interview, before her death in 2004, Chambers reflected on the decade she had spent studying the Harland case and its implications. "What haunts me most," she said, "is not what Jonathan did, horrific as it was. It's the silence that protected him, the conspiracy of the powerful to preserve a version of events that absolved them of complicity. How many other Jonathan Harlands have there been throughout history, their crimes concealed by those who valued order and reputation above truth?" It is a question without a satisfying answer, but one worth continuing to ask. The Harland estate fire, like all historical atrocities, offers not only a window into past horrors, but a mirror in which we might examine our present complicities and silences. What truths do we still avoid confronting? Whose voices remain unheard? What convenient narratives do we accept without question, because the alternative would require us to reassess our understanding of ourselves and our society? As the sun sets over Biloxi and shadows lengthen across the land where the Harland estate once stood, these questions linger like the persistent fog that rolls in from the Gulf on winter evenings. The physical evidence of Jonathan's crimes has largely vanished, consumed by fire or reclaimed by nature, but the moral implications endure. In confronting them honestly, we honor the memory of those who suffered at his hands and perhaps edge closer to a world where such suffering is less likely to be inflicted, ignored, or forgotten. The story of Master Jonathan Harland and the inferno that consumed his estate is, in the end, not primarily about the specific horrors he perpetrated. It is about the broader horror of a society that enabled him, the systems that protected him, and the narratives that obscured the truth for generations. It is about the courage of those who preserved evidence against all odds. Sarah Turner with her hidden journal, Frederick Winters with his belated crisis of conscience, and those who later uncovered that evidence and forced a reckoning with an uncomfortable past. In the silence that follows the telling of such stories, perhaps the most fitting response is not fear or fascination, but a renewed commitment to vigilance, against abuses of power, against convenient lies, against our own tendency to look away from truths that disturb our peace of mind. For the true horror of the Harland estate, fire lies not in its exceptional nature, but in its place within a larger pattern that continues to this day, wherever power operates without accountability and truth is sacrificed for comfort. As you drive along the Mississippi coast, past the unmarked turn that once led to the crown jewel of Biloxi society, remember that the most dangerous monsters are not supernatural creatures, but human beings who believe their pursuits justify any means. And remember, too, that such monsters thrive in silence and shadow, fearing nothing so much as the light of truth and the voices of those who refuse to be silenced. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. The door to Jonathan Harland's secrets has been opened, and through it we glimpse not only the specific evils he committed, but the universal capacities for both cruelty and courage that define our shared humanity. In that recognition lies both the deepest horror and the only hope for redemption.